Sorry, boy, but his captain's got to teach his men what happens to those what crossing.
Captain's got to teach stuff.
Good morning from the Bat Cave. It is Sunday, June 23rd, 2024, and I'm going to try to get going on this series that's basically going to be about the Canon. And I'm going to try to produce these as I'm working on my book, because a lot of this stuff overlaps. You have a lot of just fake literature and stuff that doesn't belong in the Bible emerging in the Second Temple period, and I mean a lot. And what you have going on in that period is very analogous. If you've heard me talk about church history and Jewish history being kind of analogous to one another, you have something very similar to what you have in the 1800s, when you have kind of this mixture of science and pseudoscience and a reemergence of the occult and Gnosticism coming back, and all the different forms of like witchcraft and mesmerism, and then all the different branches of Christianity and various cults that are borrowing from these things. Okay, it's very similar to that period, and that's why you're going to have a lot of literature produced that seems like, kind of sounds like, and even somewhat feels like scripture, but it's not. Okay. Now, I'm going to try to break this down, and I'm going to try to give you an overview here before I get into the individual books, and I'm going to try to trace this down to the root sources, because this stuff is going to be in my Way of the Serpent book. And what it is what it looks like it is when you have the Jews being taken into captivity, first with the Assyrians, then with the Babylonians, and then with the Persians. What you have is the Jews being introduced to Aramaic, and you also have them being introduced to the broader world that is mostly Aramaic speaking by this time. So you're going to have, I think you might have like the New Avestan language, which is the language of the Zoroastrians, being spoken in Persia. But the Middle East is still all speaking Aramaic. It's still the major trade language. The Persians aren't trying to make people speak their language or anything like that. And that starts with the Assyrians. The Aramaic language starts with the Aramaeans, but because the Aramaeans are between the Babylonians and the Egyptians for the most part, and the Jews, it becomes a central trade language in the Middle East. It's pretty close to Hebrew, and it's pretty close to Arabic. So it's not that hard to kind of learn a version of it, because it's kind of like imagine if Italian started becoming the world language because the Romans took over, but you're from Spain and you know Spanish, and it's not terribly hard to learn Italian from Spanish. So Aramaic becomes the central language, and obviously the Persians, they're speaking a Japhetite language. It's kind of probably a mix of Semitic from the Elamites and the Babylonians, and then Turkic languages and Median languages. Okay, so what they have in that blend, in that mix, is now becoming kind of the predecessor to Farsi, and the rest of the world speaking Aramaic. And so what you have is you have a lot of myths and legends that are coming together that have a lot of similarity to them, because these myths all originated with true stories, and then things getting mixed together after the Tower of Babel. So what you have is a lot of falsehood and a lot of conjecture, and then it seems like you have Jews that are pulling this stuff together and trying to compare it to the Bible, similarly to what I'm doing with my Way of the Serpent book, and saying this is that. Okay? And out of that, you have groups of people who are emerging that are writing fake writings. They're just false writings ascribed to people like Enoch, to the patriarchs, to Levi, to the Book of Jubilees is ascribed to Moses, claiming that an angel told it to him on Mount Sinai, and they're just lies. There's no other way to put it. Your scholars don't like to just use words like they lied, they made this up, it's propaganda, but it really is. It's just falsehood and it's propaganda. And unfortunately, because people are so ignorant and so speculative nowadays, and not that educated before they decide to go put out a YouTube channel and be a champion debater on bullcrap. We have a lot of this stuff coming back. A lot of it is coming through the Hebrew roots movement. A lot of it is coming through various people who are deconstructing, and then various people in the debate dojo who like to reinvigorate a heresy or bring up some argument that's been beat to death for 500 years, but it's new to them, and so they're going to be the champion debater on that thing, you know. And this is just going to keep getting worse because, again, people are running to and fro and knowledge is increasing, and you're going to have the good and bad version of that. And what you're going to see is you're going to see YouTube and, you know, the debate forums become kind of like a new televangelism of bullcrap. And it's going to keep getting worse. People are going to keep getting confused. And in time, you're going to probably see the Jews and ultimately the false prophet draw this stuff together and draw it towards the Antichrist, just like these Jews were doing back in the day, okay? Now, this era where all these writings seem to start emerging does seem to be after the Maccabees, okay? We don't have strong evidence that the Septuagint existed before the Maccabees. You probably have a Greek translation of the Law of Moses because you have the Jews having moved to Alexandria from the days of Jeremiah. But the only real canon you had back then was the 5 books of Moses. Yes, you had prophetic scriptures that were authoritative, but you didn't have them held in a book. You probably had a tradition of the prophets holding their own writings, and a tradition of the priests holding their own writings, and a tradition of the house of David holding their own writings. And after they get back from Persia or back from Babylon, during the Persian era, is when those things start to come together. And we see evidence in the Maccabees that even by the time of the Maccabees, there's clear evidence of writings being pulled together. It looks like Nehemiah this is the claim in Second Maccabees, is the one who had the writings from the house of David, and there seems to be other additional writings, but Ezra and Nehemiah seem to have these writings and these records from the house of David, which became First and Second Chronicles, and then obviously they would have had the Psalms and the Proverbs and all this stuff from the temple. You would have probably had the priesthood, but you probably had the house of David having copies of those things too. Okay. But they wouldn't have been in a canon. They wouldn't have been circulated. You wouldn't have had anything like a church going around where people have their own copies. Remember, the law, the Jews were meant to come up to the temple every year and have the law read. And obviously, if you're wealthier and you could afford a scribe to copy the law for you, then you'd have a copy of your own. So you probably have aristocratic families that would have that. But it would just be the law. You wouldn't necessarily have people who had Joshua and Judges and all the other books that become the Jewish canon by that time. And so by the time you get to the Maccabean period, it looks like what the Maccabees are trying to do, if you read 1st and 2nd Maccabees and you have some discernment, it looks like what the Maccabees are trying to do is claim that Daniel's 70 weeks is over. And they've freed the land of Israel from the Gentiles. They've restored the kingdom. They try to align some things with Judah Maccabees with prophecies related to Judah that ultimately go to Christ. And then they try to align, this is going to be his, let's see. So Judah Maccabees, it's going to be his nephew, John Hyrcanus, as like a Melchizedek. And he takes on this title, Priest of the Most High God. He actually has the title High Priest and Ethnarch. And he is taking on the role of priest and king. And it's his, he inherits that from his dad. Remember, Judah Maccabees is a military leader. Matthias is a Levite who starts the revolt. That's their dad, and his sons carried on. Judah is basically a military leader, and then he dies. And I think it's his brother Jonathan who takes on the high priest after him. I'm going to review this stuff as I go through the writings, but and then Simon, I believe, is the high priest, and then I think Jonathan dies, and then Simon takes on the whole thing. I could be mistaken on this. I read this like last week, but it's not all sticking in my memory. And then John Hyrcanus is going to take over for him. And he's both high priest and ethnarch. He is not taking the title king yet because they know this is a big deal, right? To take the title of priest and king, only the Messiah can do that, okay? What you have is eventually you have, it looks like his descendants start taking the title high priest and king. And one of them, and I don't know exactly how this works out, I think it's Aristobulus marries Alexandra, and then Alexander marries Janaeus after. I don't know exactly how this works out. If it's like a widowhood thing or what, because it looks like John Hyrcanus has 2 sons, and they're both married to Salome. But Alexandra is going to be the one who gives basically, the Sadducees have authority over the priesthood. But you have, where you're going to have is the Pharisees get authority over interpreting the law in her day. Okay, they existed before that, but she's the one who gives them the authority. And then what they end up with is building a Sanhedrin between the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And there's probably other elders in it, because the Sanhedrin is meant to be made up of all the elders of Israel. But most of the elders most of these aristocrats are going to be from the lines of David and Levi. There are some from other tribes that you can see in the Book of Chronicles, but those are going to be the main 2. And so what you're going to have then is Alexandra has 2 sons, and those 2 sons are going to have a civil war over the kingdom. And Ptolemy, his name is escaping me off the top of my head, but he's the guy who basically gets in a fight with Julius Caesar over a civil war before Caesar and Mark Antony, and I'm forgetting his name off the top. But that Roman general basically gets sick of this civil war, and he ends up basically just taking over Jerusalem, and I think he sets up like a puppet, and eventually this turns into giving authority to Antipater, which is Herod's dad, and then Herod is going to marry one of the descendants of the line of the Hasmoneans to kind of legitimize his rule. So Herod the Great is married to basically one of these Levitical Hasmoneans, and then Herod, who is going to be the Herod in Jesus' day, is actually part Levite, which is why John the Baptist is calling him out for breaking the law. He's not only living in the land, but he is part Levite, and he's married to his brother's widow, okay? So this whole period, you're looking at about 100 and... I mean, by the time you get to Christ, it's close to 200 years. But during this time, what you have is a gradual attempt by these Hasmoneans, because remember, they don't know they're going to get taken over by the Romans. They think they've delivered themselves from Greek rule. And since some of the prophecies in Daniel kind of have the Antichrist coming out of Greek rule, and it's not specifically naming the Romans, like it names the Persians and it names the Greeks, but it doesn't specifically name the Romans, okay? And so what you have is kind of a belief that the Daniel 70 weeks period is over. And if you look at the Septuagint version of Daniel that was written at that time, it is very butchered. It talks about there being 7 and 70 and 42 weeks. So it doesn't make sense to have a 70 weeks prophecy like we have in our versions today. It's just really jacked up. And so you don't have a real clear way to say it. And the Septuagint versions of Daniel that appear that in that time seem to be indicating someone like a Judah Maccabees coming and basically delivering the kingdom but dying, okay, which is what Judah Maccabees did. And I suspect that Septuagint version of Daniel was actually changed by the Maccabees to make it look like Judah was essentially the Messiah that dies, and then the Messiah that reigns afterwards is his brother John Hyrcanus. That seems to be what they're trying to do. So I went through and I read first and probably about half of Second Maccabees. I haven't read the whole thing yet. One of the things you need to know is that Hanukkah, the whole Hanukkah story, these guys made stuff up, okay? I don't believe the Hanukkah story with the 8 days of oil happened. Now, people are going to be like, oh, Jesus celebrated that holiday, therefore it's legit. No. It just means it's custom in his day. Just means he went up to Jerusalem for that custom. And what are they celebrating? Well, they're celebrating the rededication of the temple after Messiah. That doesn't mean that Jesus believed this 8 days of oil miracle, okay? The reason I don't believe it is because 1st and 2nd Maccabees both talk about the rededication of the temple, and they never mention this miracle. So, but what they do mention is 2nd Maccabees is another bullcrap miracle, I think, and that's this myth that Nehemiah, basically, they have this myth that Jeremiah told them to bury some coals from the altar before the temple was destroyed, and Jeremiah went and took the ark and the tabernacle to some secret cave where nobody knows where it is, which I think is all just BS. I think the Ark of the Covenant just burned with it's a wooden box inside a wooden box. I think it just burned with the temple, okay? We don't have any record of the tabernacle being kept or upkept once the temple was built, and you're talking, 500 years. I really doubt the cloth held up long enough to have a tabernacle again. And we know Jeremiah was taken away from Jerusalem in chains and then released, but this is all happening during the period where probably Babylonian soldiers are like raping and pillaging Jerusalem for a month, and then they burn the tabernacle. So it's like 30 days from Jerusalem being broken into to the temple being burned. And in that 30 days, they're not just like in a nice organized fashion, like trying to figure out how to take care of these people. They're taking out anyone of value. They're taking them in slavery to Babylon, and then they're leaving the poorest of the poor there. But these are soldiers who've been besieging the city for a couple years. They're doing some raping. Like, that's just what's going on. They're raping and pillaging. That's what happens in every war. When soldiers finally break into a city, and Jerusalem had money, and they probably were ransacking these houses and pillaging everything, taking everything they could, raping the women, drinking and having a good time, and then when they're done, they burned it. They burned it all down, okay? So the idea that Jeremiah was able to sneak out, like the idea that anyone was able to sneak out anything is just kind of absurd, okay? But what you do have, you got to remember, in the original deportation, when Daniel and Ezekiel and guys like that come out, you got to remember that one is you have priests and you have people from the line of David coming out, which means these are people with money. These are people with copies of the scriptures. We know Daniel had a copy of the law. We know Daniel had a copy of Jeremiah, which means Daniel probably had an updated copy of everything in the scriptures, okay? You have these guys coming out, and if you remember what happens, I think it might be Jeconiah, I think it is. He's the second to last one. Zedekiah is the one when it gets besieged and taken. But Jeconiah rebels against Nebuchadnezzar, and then he surrenders, okay? So he surrenders without a war, and what ends up happening is that they're, as punishment, they take him and then put Zedekiah on the throne, and then they take a bunch of the nobles. So they're going to take people from the priestly class, they're going to take people from the aristocracy, they take skilled tradesmen, which means they probably take scribes too, and those people are being taken not in chains, they're just being deported, which means they're probably packing up their belongings and bringing it with them, which means a lot of books and stuff like that would have made it out by that time. And so these aristocracies would have had their libraries and stuff, okay? Well, according to these guys, Jeremiah instructed them to bury some coals from the altar that they're going to use to relight it later, even though the Bible says it's going to be 70 years of desolation. But this is going to be a miracle they make up. And in the miracle, Nehemiah instructs them to go unbury these coals, and they do, but the coals are like a thick water, and then he spreads this thick water on the logs, and the logs ignite, okay? That kind of sounds like Greek fire or something weird like that, but this is just absurd. It sounds like they're describing Greek fire in the days of the Maccabees, which would have been around, but it's just absurd, okay? It's just an absurd legend. One is Jeremiah would have had no contact with Nehemiah. Jeremiah stays in the land. Nehemiah is the cupbearer in Persia. He's born from the captivity. They would have had no access to each other. It's just dumb, okay? Two, this whole idea of coals from the altar turning into water and then somehow being used to relight wood. That's just dumb. It's just dumb. Three is we have Nehemiah. It's not mentioned, okay? Like we have Ezra and Nehemiah. They're going to say stuff that's made up about Ezra and Nehemiah. They're basically adding hearsay accounts and legends in the book of Maccabees. But what they're also going to say is that this might have some truth to it, is that Nehemiah had formed a library of all the books that they had collected after the captivity, which is probably true. Okay, but then that library is saying that it gets destroyed when Antiochus Epiphanes basically wrecks everything. Okay, and then what they say is that Judah Maccabees goes and regathers all that. Okay, well, this is what I think is really going on. There probably is some truth to Nehemiah having, a collection of all the books of, what become the canon, because Ezra and Nehemiah would have been over kind of establishing and finalizing that and writing the Chronicles. And the Chronicles is basically a record of the aristocracy, so you want to know who these people are because they're actually dividing land up amongst them, okay? But what you probably have happen is that the Maccabees say, oh, we have all these special, obviously authoritative, extra-biblical writings, and we're going to give you copies of them if you need them. And they're telling the Jews in Alexandria to come up for the Feast of Tabernacles because they're talking like they've delivered Israel basically from the Gentile captivity. Okay? And then they're talking about these extra books they have. Well, one of the books seems to be First Maccabees, but this is probably where the Apocrypha start to come in, okay? And the Apocrypha, you have additions to Daniel, who could be based on word of mouth, hearsay, or maybe even true stories. Like the story of Bel and the dragon and, the story of Susanna that are in Daniel, they could be based on truth. They could be based on hearsay. It could be something like the woman caught in adultery, and it's not in what Daniel wrote, but these are true stories about Daniel, or they could just be legends about Daniel, or they could be bullcrap. We don't know. What we do know is that Daniel didn't write that down. Okay, so it's not in the book of Daniel because the book of Daniel was written by Daniel. It's that simple. I mean, he's literally talking about himself in the first person throughout the book. Okay, so we don't have additional stories by Daniel because Daniel would have wrote those down if we need to keep them. Okay, you have Tobit and Judith, and you have stories that are obviously fiction. Okay, I think it's Judith. One of the two stories has like Nebuchadnezzar ruling over Assyria and living in Nineveh, and the Jews being deported to Nineveh, and so they're just merging together stuff about the Babylonian captivity with Nineveh. It makes no sense. Okay, there's just stuff in it that it's just absurd. It's just fairy tales. It's just bedtime stories. Okay. But somehow, somebody thinks it's inspired because it sounds really great and it mentions an angel somewhere. And these are the kind of things that seem to come in under the Maccabees. Well, what these guys are going to try to do in all three sects of Judaism, with the exception of Zealous just like killing, okay? The three sects of the Judaism, which is going to be end up being the Pharisees, Sadducees, and Essenes, they all seem to have their extra biblical literature, okay? Now, the Sadducees seem to tend to mix Greek philosophy, and Philo would be an example of them. Philo is going to be mixing stuff that looks like it comes from astrology via Pythagoras. Pythagoras, Plato, and Stoicism is going to be mostly what they mix, and then it seems like these apocryphal books start to circulate in that period. Some of these apocryphal books, and I haven't studied all of them in the scholarly, evidence on the origins and stuff like that, but some of them seem to come from after Christ, okay? Anything written by a Jew after Christ, anything written by something that's not an apostolically affirmed source after Christ is not canon, just automatically, because Christ gave the exclusive authority to bind and loose to the apostles, which means anything in the canon after that has to come from the apostles. That's what binding and loosing means. It means this is their proper interpretation of the law, okay? And what you're going to have, what they're really competing against are these three different sects who are all claiming to have extra biblical knowledge and therefore the authority to rightfully interpret the Bible and lead the Jewish people, okay? And these three sects are going to be the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the Essenes. Now, the Sadducees are going to look at it as like it's all allegorical, and we basically filter things through the philosophers because they're appointed by the Hasmoneans. Because I don't think the Hasmoneans are from the line of Zadok. I could be wrong. No, I take that back. They are. They're from the line of Phineas, at least we know, because they say in Maccabees that our ancestor Phineas was promised an eternal priesthood. And of course, that promise filters down through Zadok. And if you know your scriptures well, a daughter of the second Zadok the second is going to marry into the line of David, and it's ultimately that promise is going to be fulfilled in Christ. But the Hasmoneans don't want you to know that. The Hasmoneans want you to think it's fulfilled in the Hasmoneans. And they're really trying to be the Messianic reign. And this seems to be the origin of the two Messiahs theory. Remember, you have multiple theories going around, but the idea of a Messiah ben David and a Messiah ben Joseph, a suffering servant and then a servant that is exalted, seems to be based on Judah, who dies, and then his brother takes over and is priest and king. So it's kind of like a type of the Lord that died and the Lord that was raised. And what you find in 1 Maccabees, I'm going to just give you an example of things I found. In 1 Maccabees, he says, Judah was like a lion and like a lion's whelp roaring for his prey. That's right out of Genesis 49:9. That is a messianic prophecy given to Judah, not Judah Maccabees, Judah, because Jesus is going to come from his line. 1 Maccabees says Antiochus ordered the land divided. Maybe he did, maybe he didn't. I don't know, but that's something that the Antichrist is supposed to do in Daniel 11 before the deliverance. And obviously they call him violating the temple. They call it the abomination of desolation, even though he doesn't set up anything in the holy place. He actually sets something on the altar, which is in the courtyard. Okay, so he doesn't really fulfill the abomination of desolation, but they're saying that he did, because after the abomination of desolation, well, 3.5 years later, Israel is delivered from the Antichrist, and so they're the ones who are really making out Antiochus be the Antichrist, and Jesus directly refutes that. Okay, you could say, well, it's analogous to, it's a foretype to. Yes, definitely. Daniel 11 leads you up to Antiochus and then kind of jumps ahead to the Antichrist. So Antiochus would have been a partial fulfillment, but they're stretching things a little bit to make them a full fulfillment, because we know what's said about the abomination of desolation. It's an image set up in the temple, not in the courtyard, in the temple. And I believe it's set up in the most holy place. So it looks like it doesn't specifically mention it being in the Holy of Holies, but it doesn't mention it being set up, and it mentions this guy basically blaspheming the Most High God and then getting destroyed without hand. Of course, what it mentions about the Antichrist specifically is that he goes to take over Egypt, and then on his way back, he dies. Okay? That's in Daniel 11. This is really important because Antiochus Epiphanes goes to take over Egypt, and he gets the kibosh put on his plans by the Romans, but he doesn't die. But what happens is a rumor starts to circulate that he did die. Why? Because he's doing all this stuff that seems to happen in Daniel 11. I mean, they have Daniel this whole time, and they're watching these prophecies be fulfilled in order. And now Antiochus is going to take over Egypt. And if Antiochus had taken over Egypt, he would have fulfilled everything that the Antichrist is going to do in Daniel 11. And then the last thing it says after that is that he returns and sets up his camp between the Great Sea and the Holy Mountain, and then he comes to his end there. Okay? Well, he never goes and invades Egypt. He actually partly invades Egypt and gets access to the supply chain where he could take over the whole thing, but he doesn't accomplish that. And then he does set up his camp between the Holy Mountains and the sea, and that's where the Romans confront him. It's like he's kind of in that western portion of Egypt between there and Gaza, and then the Roman diplomat to Egypt calls him out and basically draws a circle around him, and he says, if you walk out of the circle without saying you won't invade Egypt, you're going to be at war with Rome. And he punks him out. But he doesn't die. But everything in the prophecy at that time makes it look like he's going to die. And when when all this stuff happens, the rumor starts to circulate that he's going to die. And what happens is there is like a rebel faction in Israel, and this is not the Maccabees. Okay, they didn't start this rebellion. There's this other faction that tries to rise up and overthrow the priest who basically bought his office from Antiochus. So he's kind of like a puppet governor of Antiochus who's corrupt, and he's on the take, right? And so these guys rise up and overthrow that guy because they think Antiochus is dead. Then Antiochus comes back, and he is not dead, and he's pissed that they overthrew his puppet. And he's obviously just got punked by the Romans, so he's not in the mood for any of this crap. And he basically trashes the place and besieges and does a bunch of stuff, and then I think they fight back a little bit, and then he comes back, and then he does the desecration of the temple, apparently. And that leads to Matthias start to he doesn't just desecrate the temple. He forbids Judaism, forbids circumcision. There's a story that says that like some women circumcised their babies and they found out, and they killed their babies and hung them around their neck and paraded them through the street with their dead babies hanging around their necks as a testimony. And then I think they were trying to get people to either eat pork or do some pagan sacrifice or something like that. And that's when Matthias is like, I ain't trying to hear that, see. And so this is 167, 166 BC. Matthias starts fighting with his sons. He starts rebelling against us. I think Matthias kills whoever's like a priest or whoever who is like collaborating with him. I think that's what happens. And then his sons keep fighting. Judah's their leader. He does a lot of fighting, and then he goes into a battle that they know they can't win, but he's like, if I die, it's God's will kind of thing, and he goes and he dies. And then I think his brother's the high priest, but Jonathan after him gets set up as the next military leader, because they're not done fighting yet. They fight for a couple of generations before they're finally free, and it's by the time of John Hyrcanus, you literally have like 3 different leaders. You have Judas, then Simon, then Jonathan. By the time of Jonathan Hyrcanus, that's when they've won. And it seems like John Hyrcanus is the one who is writing First Maccabees. And remember, he is the one who's taken on the title priest of the Most High God, setting himself up as the new Melchizedekian priesthood. And he is basically going to be making First Maccabees sound very scripture-like. Okay, you'll find a very clear difference in the tone of First and Second Maccabees, even though they mostly cover the same events. And the reason is one's written more like just a plain historical account, which has got some fan fiction in it, and the other one is written to sound like scripture. So it sounds like stuff about David in the book of Samuel, but a lot more details about his battles and stuff like that and how glorious they were. They have him, Antiochus dividing up the land. They have him have a great slaughter in Bozrah, which is something that Christ does in Micah and Isaiah. They have in Maccabees 7:17 cites a fulfillment of Psalm 78, which seems to prophesy something that takes place in Ezekiel 38 or Zechariah 14, having to do with the destruction of all the Gentile nations. Okay, they're painting their war against the Greeks as similar to Jesus defeating all the Gentiles in the end. Because remember, they're lining up Judah Maccabees with these prophecies about Judah, okay? And it's not overt that they're doing it. They're putting stuff in there, and then they're just throwing these little lines in there that are like the prophecies. So they're throwing stuff about the abomination of desolation and the land being divided, him having a great slaughter in Bozrah, all the Gentiles being defeated, him being like a lion in a lion's whelp. But by the time you get to the end of the book, what it seems to be is like, oh, so that kind of sounds like he's the Messiah and he's the fulfillment of all this stuff, okay? Or at least he's the Messiah Ben David or Ben Joseph that dies, and then the one that goes on to reign is his nephew John Hyrcanus. And they're altering the messianic prophecies to make it look like they're fulfilling the kingdom come. So another thing I picked up on there, and I don't know how relevant this is that according to the Maccabees, or I'm sorry, this is according to Orthodox Jews today, that the Feast of Purim, Esther, okay, was originally celebrated on the 14th through 16th of Nisan. Why is that important? that's the days that Jesus Christ was in the grave. That's when, apparently, this is what the Orthodox Jews are saying. I could be mistaken on this, but I believe in 33 AD, 14th through 16th of Nisan is when the 3 days that I want to say it was like on the 14th of Nisan, that's when Jesus was crucified. Okay, so that would be 14, 15, 16. Those are the 3 days he's in the grave, and that's when Esther was originally celebrated, because that's when Esther and Mordecai prayed and fasted. Okay, they changed it to the days of the 12th and 13th of Adar, which is like December. Because that's when the Jews avenge themselves on their enemies, okay? And that change seems to have occurred in the days of the Maccabees, because it lines up with, I believe it lines up when they finally achieve victory, or when they cleanse the temple, or something like that. There's something that goes on, and let's read it. It's First Maccabees 7:49. Says in the 151st year, 749, let's see. It says, afterwards they took spoils in the prey, and they smote off Nicanor's head and his right hand, and they stretched out so proudly, and brought them away, and hanged them up towards Jerusalem. So Nicanor is going to be the heir of Antiochus Epiphanes when they find, or no, I'm sorry, this is going to be like a general of his, who basically was kicking their butt for a while, okay? And they finally get him, and it says, for this cause the people rejoiced greatly, and they kept that day as a great day of gladness. Moreover, they ordained to keep yearly this day, being the 13th of Adar, okay? So the day that the Jews, in this day is the same day as Esther, okay? Which suggests that Esther was added to, and the day that they avenged themselves on their enemies in Esther, in the book of Esther, is now being overlaid with the day that they avenged themselves on this Nicanor. Okay, so this is according to, again, this is a conjecture from Orthodox Jews in the book of Maccabees and stuff like that. The book of Esther has a note at the end of it, and it says that the Jews celebrate to this day, but that might have not been in the original testimony. It might have been changed in the days of the Maccabees. We don't know, because there's some stuff that's kind of sus about the book of Esther in terms of how it came into the canon. I'm not saying it's non-canonical. I'm just saying it was kind of disputed literature for a while, okay? I believe it happened. I believe it's canonical. I believe it's testified to by internal witness. I believe it has a ton of typology related to the gospel and the two covenants and God and Christ and stuff like that. But the testimony at the very end of this book about why they celebrate Adar may have been added to overlay that with the Maccabean thing. That may be, because it's strange to me that they would mention this being the 13th of Adar, that they celebrate this, and not mention that they celebrate Purim on the same day. If that was already being done for a couple hundred years by now, okay? Just, it doesn't make any sense, okay? So anyways, that's another thing they're doing. So I want you to see how they're changing times and laws, okay? They don't just, this is something that the Antichrist is supposed to do, is change times and laws. They don't just do that. Like when you go read, and I've got Daniel here, this is comparing Daniel 9 from Theodotion. This is going to be an early Hebrew-speaking Christian who tries to fix Daniel, and it's a lot closer than ours, compared to the Old Greek, which would have been the original Septuagint Greek version of Daniel. When you get to his 70th week, it's very changed. It says, and the covenant. So this is what I believe the Maccabean version says. Okay, it says, and you shall understand, you will rejoice and discover ordinances to respond, and you will build Jerusalem for the Lord. Okay, so notice how it's saying very different things. Now this is what the angel says to Daniel, and this is closer to what we have. And you shall know and shall understand from the going forth of the word to respond and rebuild Jerusalem. Now notice he's telling Daniel to know and understand that from the going forth of the command to rebuild Jerusalem until Messiah. Okay, this is the Adosians. He says to rebuild Jerusalem until an anointed leader. That's where we get Messiah. There will be 7 weeks and 62 weeks, and it will return, and the streets and wall will be built, and the seasons will be emptied out. Okay, it's probably a bad translation, but it says the street and wall will be built with the mow. Okay, that happens in Nehemiah's day. After 62 weeks, an anointing will be destroyed. This is the Messiah will be cut off, and there will be no judgment in it, and it will destroy the city and the sanctuary along with the leader who is to come. So you can tell this is not the greatest translation. It's not like we have today, but this is what they would have had in probably 1st or 2nd century translation, because they know the Septuagint one is jacked up, okay? And it says, and they will be cut up by a flood, and there will be annihilations to finish a shortened war, and it will strengthen a covenant with many for 1 week. And by the half of the week, the libation will cease, and in the temple there will be abomination of desolation eaten until the consummation, and the consummation will be given for the desolation. So this is a decent translation, but it's still not as accurate as what we have today, okay? We can look at stuff from like Hippolytus. He does a complete translation on Daniel, so we know they clean this up over time, okay? But if you look at the Septuagint, the old Greek version, it says this: 70 weeks have been decided for your people and for your city Sion to sin and to be consummated, to make iniquities scarce and to blot out iniquities and to comprehend the vision for everlasting righteousness and to be given in the vision and to be consummated and glad in the Holy of Holies. Okay? Notice it says 70 weeks. So whatever they have here should add up to 70 weeks. This adds up to 70 weeks. You have 7 weeks and 62 weeks in 1 week, and there's 70 weeks. Okay? Now listen to what this says. He says, and you shall understand and will rejoice and will discover ordinances to respond, and you will rebuild Jerusalem as a city for the Lord after 7 and 70 and 62 weeks. How do you got, you 70 plus 62 is 132, 133 weeks out of 70 weeks. This is just horrible translation. Well, if it's trying to place you sometime after the rebuilding of Jerusalem, remember, Jerusalem is rebuilt in 444 BC. Okay, the Maccabees come to power in like the 150s BC, 160s BC. Okay, so it's you've got about 180 years there. Okay, well this is saying 7 plus 70 plus 62 weeks. So let's do some math there. So you've got 70 plus 62 plus 7 equals 139 times 7 years, 973 years. That's all. But if they're messing it up to say, well, that's not years, whatever they're trying to be, and it's going to start getting jacked up in this time. And then it says, the King of Nations will demolish the city and the sanctuary, along with the anointed one. Now notice it says this: after 77 and 62 weeks, an anointing will be removed and will not be. And the King of Nations will demolish the city and the sanctuary, along with the anointed one, and his consummation will come with wrath until the time of the consummation. Well, that sounds exactly like what happened with Antiochus and his heirs defiling the temple and killing Judah Maccabees. This is why I think the Maccabees changed it. I think they're trying to make it sound like, now this sounds nothing like what we have today. This is closer to it, but he's literally saying a king of nations. There's Antiochus, and it would be his heirs, because I think he has like 1 or 2 sons after that rule before they're done. Antiochus will demolish the city and the sanctuary. Well, that's what he does, along with the anointed one. That would, if the anointed one they're trying to make him out to be Judah, well, he dies under Antiochus's heir, and his consummation will come with wrath even till the time of consummation. So they keep fighting against him until he's defeated. Okay. He will, now notice it says he will be attacked through war. You see how all this they have lining up with the Maccabean story of how they defeat Antiochus? And then the covenant will prevail for many, and it will return again and be rebuilt broad and long. So notice how they're talking about, he says he will strengthen a covenant with many for 1 week. And they're taking stuff about rebuilding the city and the sanctuary, right? And they're saying the city and the sanctuary will be demolished, and it will return again and be rebuilt broad and long. See, they're saying the covenant will be rebuilt rather than the city. Well, this is what the Maccabees do. And then the consummation of the times, even after 7 years and 77 times and 72 times. Notice he's saying at the consummation of the times. So notice how he's taking the 70 weeks and all this stuff and putting it after this, okay? Here it's putting the 70 weeks until the Messiah is cut off, or 69 weeks until he's cut off. Here it's saying these 7 years and 70 times and 62 times are after they restore the covenant, okay? Well, what the Maccabees seem to be trying to do is convince you that there's going to be a gradual unfolding of the kingdom. Well, how long did we just say that is? How many years is that? 70 weeks plus 62 weeks plus 7 weeks times 7 years is 973 years. That's almost a millennium. So they've just extended what happens after the Maccabees to a millennial reign. And 970 is, remember, Adam lived to be 930 years old, just falling short of a millennium. They're saying, look at the time gap. There's 27 years shy of a millennium that is going to start. And if they have this thing starting when they start fighting Antiochus, well, you have a millennium starting when they start fighting Antiochus. Okay? So you don't have to be a rocket science to look at this and go, what are they trying to pull off? Simple. They're trying to pull off that there's going to be a millennial reign that starts with the Hasmonean overthrow of Antiochus. And they've changed Daniel to comport to that. Okay? And then it says, and in the half of the week of the sacrifice of libation will cease, and the temple will be there in the abomination of desolation until the consummation of the season, and the consummation will be given for a desolation. So notice he says that this abomination of desolation will be until the consummation, and the consummation is making war on the king of the nations, okay? So what they're making as the consummation, rather than the consummation being God's wrath poured out, it's Judah Maccabee's wrath and his brother's wrath on the king of the nations, on Antiochus. So you have a complete overhaul of Daniel's 70th weeks to make it sound like you have the Maccabees coming to restore the covenant and then the millennium. You just have to just read it and do the math, okay? Now, this was in your so-called anointed Septuagint that everyone's talking about. This is what's in it. And I'm saying I believe the Septuagint was Maccabean propaganda. So what we have in 2nd Maccabees is you're going to have him writing to the Jews in Alexandria. Okay, a few things go on here, okay? So it's by 142 years. Let's do some math here. Matthias starts in 167. They free them in 142. That's 25 years, okay? What you have here is add that 25 to 973. You have almost exactly a millennium, okay? I don't know what time in the year these things started, but you have almost exactly a millennium from the time that they start fighting Antiochus Epiphanes to their corrupted version of Daniel's 70 weeks prophecy, okay? And so what you have is, he basically says, Simon Thess, he frees the Jews by 142. He subjugates the Philistines to keep the law. And he's hailed with palm branches and music in Jerusalem. Who does that sound like, okay? This is John Hyrcanus' dad. This is Judah Maccabee's brother, okay? It's Jonathan that's leading the revolt after him, and Simon is the one who's finally done, and he basically inherits the rule, essentially. He's a king. He's not calling himself a king. He's just basically calling himself like a civil ruler or something like that. I forget what it's called. Ethnarch. So basically leader of the nation, okay? That's what an ethnarch is, okay? But it's a king. He's a king. And then they start calling themselves kings within a generation. So then he says that the Hasmoneans confirm, this is after this time, that the Hasmoneans confirm a covenant with the ancient Lacedaemonians, the Spartans, and claim that this Onias, who was the high priest during the Persian rule, had a letter stating that they're brethren and they're all from the stock of Abraham, a.k.a. the Danites. They're telling the Danites You're welcome back. Why? Because in Ezekiel, the Danites come back and inherit some of the land. Okay? They're in the millennium in their brain. And so they're telling the Danites to come back and get your share of the land. And they're saying what's ours is yours and what yours is ours. And they're saying, don't worry, we don't need your help in fighting because God delivered us from the Gentiles. But you're welcome here, Spartans. Why? Because they know they're Danites. Okay? And then it was declared that Simon would be the high priest forever until there shall arise a faithful prophet. Okay? Now listen to who's saying this? This is Simon, and his son is John Hyrcanus, who is going to claim the title priest of the Most High God, which is Melchizedek's title. Okay? So Simon would be the high priest forever until there shall arise a faithful prophet. Who's the faithful prophet? You're meant to get, without them saying it, they're not going to claim it, they want people to say it about them, that John Hyrcanus is the Messiah. And then Judah was Messiah ben Joseph, and he's Messiah ben David. And he's going to rule and reign. Okay? And second Maccabees, John Hyrcanus, he says the myth, I told you about the myth about the fire already, so we're not going to do that again. Second Maccabees claims Jeremiah take the Ark of the Covenant. I told you about that claim again. That's BS. Why are they doing that? Probably because they're setting themselves up to make a new fake Ark of the Covenant. That's probably why. Okay? Because it's supposedly hidden in a cave that Jeremiah hid, and the plan is one day we're going to go make a fake Ark of the Covenant and say that we found it and brought the glory back. Okay? Second Maccabees claims that Nehemiah collected the writings of David, and what they're going to do is they're going to write to the Jews abroad, which are mostly Greek-speaking now, Greek and Aramaic speaking, and saying, hey, we have all these writings that were secret writings or that were preserved by Nehemiah and then scattered but recollected by Judah. And if you guys need copies of these also authoritative biblical writings, we have them so you can come get them. To the Jews that were living in Egypt from the time of the Babylonian captivity, and then they would have mixed with Jews from the Persian captivity because the Persians do take over Egypt. And then they're going to mix with people from the Greek captivity. Okay, so you have these Jews who've been there for a long time, and they don't have a full canon yet. And this is where they get to insert Maccabees and different stuff like that into their canon. And it's the Jews that come from Babylon who know this is bullcrap who form the Masoretes eventually. Okay, these are going to be more Jews that are speaking Hebrew and Aramaic, and they're not part of this. This is a community of Jews that remain in Babylon, and they know that this is bullcrap, and they don't buy the Septuagint, and they don't buy any of this Hasmonean bullcrap. And they're going to be the ones who form the traditions that becomes the Masoretic text, okay? So, it says Judah, let's see, went on to remind them of the ways God helped their ancestors during the time of sin. So this is just a weird story that I found in here. I think this was in 2 Maccabees as well. He says, Judas remind them of the ways God helped their ancestors during the time of Sennacherib. 185,000 of the enemy has been destroyed. That's in the Bible. That's in 1 Kings. And then he says, and once in Babylonia, 8,000 Jews came to the help of 4,000 Macedonians, defeating 120,000 Galatians and taking a great deal of loot, all because of God's help. So they're saying that 8,000 Jews apparently beat the crap out of 120,000 Galatians with 4,000 Macedonians during the time of the Babylonian Empire. Maybe they were contingents in the army. I don't know. This is weird. Okay, so I haven't read all Second Maccabees, but I know it's propaganda mixed with myth, mixed with legend, and even with all that, you still don't have the Hanukkah story in it. Okay, which is why I think the Hanukkah story was later fabricated bullcrap. And within this context, some of these extra books that they have seem to be things like Judith and Tobit and stuff like that, which are probably stuff that individual households have. Maybe it's fiction, who knows? And that seems to be their extra biblical claim. But the main thing is to squeak in their fake stuff from Daniel in the book of Maccabees to make it look like they're in the Messianic kingdom. Okay? So that's what happens. That's one school of thought. And that is, going to really continue to the Sadducees, who seem to just be Hellenists, because again, they don't maintain their rule. They maintain their rule for close to 200 years. About 150 years until the the Herods take over. Okay, but you've got a good century of their rule and believing they're in the millennium. Okay, and of course over time, what do? Well, they Hellenize. Why? Because they're sucking up to the Romans and they're sucking up to the Spartans, and they pretty much use the Romans to get Antiochus Epiphanes off their back. Then Antiochus Epiphanes' kingdom pretty much dies, and then they fight over who's in charge. And the reason the Romans are helping them is because Antiochus Epiphanes is a rival, and after him, the Parthians, who take over the Persian part of his kingdom, they become a rival, and they need a stable Israel where they can host bases, and they can have a good economy, and they have a good, robust economy of people who don't want to leave Roman rule, and so that they can bolster up against a potential incursion from Parthia. And so because of that, they're going to boost up the Herods and make the Herods pretty independent, and just basically say, you keep our borderland strong and don't let riots happen in Jerusalem, and try to have them get independence again, like in the Maccabees' time. And that's where the Zealots are going to try to be like them. Now, Alexandra is going to exalt the Pharisees, and the Pharisees have something different. So the Pharisees, and again, I'm going to add more details to this in time, and it's all going to be in my book. The Pharisees have the Targum, and the Targum is basically just sermons, okay? It's just people. Remember, the Jews mostly start to speak Aramaic, and the ones who read the scriptures to them, they're reading in Hebrew, and then they're explaining it in English. And they're going to be adding their own little notes and their commentaries, and this is what I think that means, just like pastors do today. And people are going to write this stuff down and start to treat it like it's authoritative, okay? These Targums that start to get written down, and I'm going to probably botch this, but this is the general, start to be repeated orally. And these Targums that are explanations of people who came before them, a lot of them are BS, and they become the Mishnah. And the Mishnah eventually gets written down and codified, and it becomes the Talmud, okay? This tradition starts in Babylon. But the Pharisees seem to be associated with that tradition. And so they seem to have the extra cool biblical rules of how to interpret the law properly and how to practice the law properly. And of course, they add a bunch of stuff which we know Jesus rebukes them for, okay? I've read somewhere, and I don't know if this is bunk or not, that the word Pharisees has to do with the word Pharisees because they came from the Persian Empire. Like they were still among the Parthians or the Persians for a time, versus under the Hellenized Jews. Okay, I don't know if that's true. I'd have to double check that. I'm not going to put it in a book before I research that thoroughly. But the Pharisees seem to be part of a tradition that is closer to the Jewish tradition that came before them versus the Hellenized tradition, which a lot of the Sadducees are Hellenized. A lot of the Jews were Hellenized by this time. You had Jews having naked gymnasiums and coliseums and having a surgery to make themselves look uncircumcised. Gosh, how painful that had to be. Boy, it's like trying to pull a turtleneck over your head, and it's just way too tight. Ugh. Anyways, so this is the Pharisees' tradition, okay? This is going to be, generally speaking, the Sadducees' tradition because they're in bed with the Hasmoneans for a while, and they're related to them, okay? The third one is going to be the Essenes, okay? And the Essenes seems to start with a tradition. The Essenes are Jewish Gnostics. Like, I'm fully convinced they're Jewish Gnostics. Philo is a Jewish Gnostic too, but he's more of a philosophical syncretist, where the Essenes are mixing myth, okay? And here's where I'm at with this in my research so far, okay? There is a tradition that starts with this Book of the Giants. Now, this Book of the Giants seems to have its origin when the Jews were mixing with the Babylonians and Persians. It seems to connect stuff from Zoroastrianism, Judaism, and the Epic of Gilgamesh, along with history that is post-flood history about real giants, like Og, king of Bashan, okay? Or like Humbaba, who is like the giant who Gilgamesh kills in the Epic of Gilgamesh. And what it does is it creates myths and legends about these guys and then says that those legends took place before the flood. And in those stories of the books of the giants and these legends that took place before the flood, which are really Tower of Babel corrupted versions of where Zoroastrianism came from, and I believe Zoroastrianism came from Canon, who is this guy who's in Luke 3, and I believe that Nimrod is this guy, his name's like Vishtamsha or whatever, who is a guy who is a king who patronizes Zoroaster and helps spread his religion through conquest. Okay, think Muhammad, but Nimrod. Okay, and what you have then is these stories all get mixed together and form these myths of the giants. And within that context, what they're saying is, and we got this from a book of Enoch. Okay, the book of Enoch hasn't been written yet. They're saying this stuff came from a book that Enoch had. Okay, Enoch wrote all this stuff down. This is how we know. Well, why don't the Jews have a very clear record of a book of Enoch if we have this? I mean, we have the book of the righteous, the book of the wars of the Lord. Why don't they ever mention the book of Enoch? This seems important since they're giving you an account of the giants. And the answer is because Enoch didn't write no book. If anything, so this is how these legends seem to be mixing together, okay? I'm going to give you 2 or 3 accounts, okay? Because the book of Enoch first Enoch seems to be the next thing written. The book of Jubilees seems to be written based on the book of Enoch, and the testimony of the patriarchs seems to be written based on the book of Jubilees, okay? It is a tradition. It's a false parallel Bible tradition, okay? That is literally giving these guys the authority to claim that they were mystery religion stuff that only Moses knew. And only the people who had this secret language, and these are things that are written in the heavenly tablets of these angels and blah, blah, blah. And only if you have the secret mystery knowledge that we have will you know the real story of what really happened and how to properly understand the Bible. Okay? And I'll short story this for you. Jews are awesome and pure, and Gentiles are pieces of crap and God hates them. Pretty much it. When Simeon and Levi killed all the Shechemites, and Jacob was ticked off about it, and so he ordained that they would be dispersed throughout the tribes of Israel, they say that they did a righteous thing. And God was so happy that they killed those ugly, stupid Gentiles that he made Levi a high priest. There's so many things. I'm going to get into these individual books. There's so many things that are false and contradict Scripture in them, because it really is another racist, anti-Gentile sect. So when you have guys like this guy, I'm just going to show you some advocates for some of these books here, okay? Because these guys have a prominence on the internet. One is Ken Johnson. Ken Johnson runs a website called Bible Facts. He's been running this website for 16 years. He is a big advocate of these books and the Essenes. He is making a totally false claim, and he's constantly falsifying information, not on accident, that the Essenes became Christians. The Essenes were pre-trib rapture believers, and a lot of the stuff he is saying is getting fed into the Messianic Jewish community and filtered around by even bigger idiots, okay? I've listened to this guy for probably 5 to 10 years. I used to like a lot of the stuff that he says because he spends a lot of time actually reading these texts. But when I go back and read the things he says about text, not the stuff he reads, but the stuff that he says about text, when I go back and read it, it's false every time. Every time it's false. And I can't believe that this guy's been publishing these books. Okay, he's publishing the Dead Sea Scrolls. He's publishing the Book of Jubilees. He's publishing the Testimony of the Patriarchs. So the fact that he keeps lying about what they say when he's published the books, I know he's got an agenda. And his agenda seems mostly to prop up extra biblical kind of Messianic Jewish knowledge and the pre-trib rapture. Okay, most people would think that's kind of benign. I don't think that's benign. I think the pre-trib rapture is dangerous if it's not a pre-trib rapture, because it gets everybody not prepared for what's coming, okay? And when he is willing to lie this much And I mean, he doesn't just lie about these guys. He lies about the church fathers too. I'm saying every single time I read something that he said in the original text, he is full of crap. Okay? He is full of crap, and we're going to go over some of those things. Okay? Not in this video, but we'll go over in this another one. Another guy is this guy who, again, and he's been doing this for 16 years. He's got 80,000 subs. He's in the Calvary Chapel and Messianic Jewish community are going to listen to this guy. Okay? Then you've got this guy, Scripture in Context. No, Kingdom in Context, I'm sorry. You got this retard, Kingdom in Context. His name is Sean something or other. He, as far as I can tell, he is a Torah observant flat earther. He's on Standing for Truth all the time. He regularly, he flat out claims that the Book of Jubilees is canon, is scripture, and so is the testimony of Levi, and I think the testimonies of the patriarchs, which is where the testimony of Levi is found. We're going to go over all those, and I'm going to show you. They disagree with the scripture. They're built on each other, okay? Remember, this all goes back to this Book of the Giants, and this Book of the Giants, just so you know, this doesn't seem to be primarily a Jewish work. It may have spread alongside the Jewish version, which is, I mean, maybe it's the original, but this book has spread to the Hindus, to the Buddhists, to the Muslim Uyghurs in China have this, okay? This book is all over the Eastern world, which makes it seem like this is something that was somebody, maybe not even a Jewish scribe, but it could have been adopted by the Essenes, who was mixing stuff from Zoroastrianism, the Epic of Gilgamesh, and Judaism during the period where the Jews were in captivity to the Persians, because that's when all three of those things would have mixed, and produced an original writing in Aramaic. That's what it seems to be, and the Qumran cave seems to have this. But there are versions of this in a ton of different languages, and I mean a ton. The Book of the Giants, we just have fragments of it all over the world, but it got all over the world at least by the days of Mani, and Mani was 3rd century A.D. Manichaeanism. Augustine was very influenced by that. But we have this in Middle Persian. We have it in Uyghur. These are guys who the Chinese are persecuting right now. These are Chinese people, okay? Sogdian, I think, is closer to like Afghanistan, Middle Persian, Sogdian. Sogdian, Middle Persian. Coptic, we have it in Egypt. Parthian, we have it in Persia. And then we know we have it in Aramaic too, okay? What one was the original? It's hard to tell. Scholars are kind of torn between which came first, the Book of the Giants or the Book of Enoch. I think the Book of the Giants came first. This is what I think happened. I think that when the Jews and the Persians and the Babylonians got together and they were all speaking Aramaic, remember, Daniel was over the Magi, and the Magi were known to mix different religious stuff, okay? Even you get down to the Islamic Magi, okay? They're going to mix Islam in with it in Persia and stuff like that. They just keep mixing stuff from other people's stuff, and what they keep doing is claiming to be the OG who has the secrets from the beginning, okay? Well, Daniel was over the Magi that time, which means they had access to the scriptures, because Daniel had access to the scripture. We know the Magi knew about Jesus, so we know they had access to Jewish stuff. And what probably happened is someone in the Magi, could have been a Jew, could have been a Magi, who knows, somebody started trying to line up stuff that these guys were getting, the Babylonians were probably interpreting from cuneiform, which is Epic of Gilgamesh stuff. It's going to be in Akkadian and Sumerian, but it's going to be translated down the road like everything else. Stuff from Zoroastrian legendism, which I believe Zoroastrianism is Canon, who was essentially Nimrod's propaganda minister. And that stuff seems to start emerging almost immediately after the Tower of Babel, I believe, happened. Okay? And then stuff from the Bible. And so you'll have guys that seem like they're talking about Og, king of Bashan. Seems like they're talking about Gilgamesh. And then you have definitely Zoroastrian stuff in it. And that may have been added by Manny after the fact. We don't know because we have just a bunch of fragments from all over the place. Or it may have been added during that period because all this stuff would have been fully formed. And I'm looking at it and seeing how this seems to line up with Nimrod. And this seems, I mean, when we get into the stuff, when I start talking about Zoroastrianism and the original stuff that they said, there's so much stuff that is very clear. Canon was the OG false prophet, and he's the author of the Magi and Zoroastrianism, and that they're basically mixing and merging stuff about a triune God of a masculine father, a feminine Holy Spirit, and then a coming somehow part God, part man type person, okay? So you have a proto-evangelion in there somewhere, okay? And the feminine goddess is associated with wisdom, which the Holy Spirit is, and the waters, okay? Which the Holy Spirit lighted upon the waters in Genesis, okay? And that's why she gets associated with the lotus flower, which is like a flower that blooms on lily pads and lights upon the waters, okay? That's where that comes from. And then that gets merged with Inanna or Ishtar, who's this whore that sleeps with angels to produce Nephilim, and those two become merged together in the Babylonian Zoroastrian culture over time, okay? So it seems like all this stuff is mixing all this stuff together. It definitely didn't come from Enoch. It definitely didn't come from the pre-flood world. Just practice some common sense. If there was a book of Enoch, do you think we'd have 2 lines about the Nephilim before the flood in all of the book of Genesis? If there was a book of Enoch. Do you think Moses, who was a prince of Egypt and pretty much the heir of Joseph, who was a prime minister of Egypt, who had all the mysteries and all the knowledge of the world because they were the most powerful empire in the world, they wouldn't have had the book of Enoch? Common sense, you guys. No, there was not a book of Enoch. There was a book of the righteous, and there could have been stuff that Enoch said in the book of righteous, because you're talking about that was written by Shem, who, if my theory that Melchizedek is Shem and the book of righteous was originally from Shem and kept until the line of David, then it is possible that Enoch, or that Shem would have known some stuff about Enoch, because he lived 500 years before he lived 100 years before the flood. Okay, so it is possible that there is some oral history of things that Enoch actually said that seeped into the Jewish culture, because Shem and Heber both seem to have lived in Canaan for 500 years after the flood. Okay, so there's a big possibility that you had some oral history of stuff that Enoch would have said. Okay, and that probably is what Jude is quoting. And it's not verbatim from the book of Enoch, but it probably is from a common source. It doesn't necessarily have to be from the book of Enoch. Okay? Is there other oral history and there's other prophetic stuff that the Jews had? Absolutely there is, because we read about it we read about Jonah's prophecies in the book of Kings that aren't in the book of Jonah. Okay? So we know prophets prophesied things, we know people wrote them down, and not everything makes the canon. Okay? So yes, there's oral history. Yes, there's probably some stuff that Enoch said. But what happens next seems to be that someone takes the Book of the Giants and takes this oral history about what Enoch says and puts it together with other myths. And I'm going to give you 2 different versions of a myth, okay? So Josephus is going to have one version of this myth. And the Book of Jubilees has another. And the Book of Jubilees seems to be based on the Book of Enoch, okay? But even still, it doesn't line up perfectly, okay? So, according to Josephus, Adam, could be some of that oral history that maybe Shem had, okay? So maybe there's some truth to it. Adam had been given a prophecy by God that the world was going to be destroyed once by water and once by fire, but he didn't know which one was going to come first. This is in Antiquities of the Jews on the flood or whatever, okay? And because of that, he basically says that the line of Seth had kept careful history of all this astronomical data and all of this, basically like an almanac, things having to do with the ebbs and flows of the seasons and growing and rains and stuff like that. as it lines up with the astrological calendar. Okay, now this is not astrology. This is just literally keeping track of the cycles of days, weeks, months, years, and how the stars align, and probably constellations were a part of that in the night sky when things tend to happen. And what Josephus said is that, now Josephus believes in the Nephilim. He talks about the Nephilim. He doesn't mention the book of Enoch. That should be obvious. He mentions extra biblical stuff about the Nephilim, not a whole lot, but he doesn't mention the book, or he mentions interpretive stuff of the book of Enoch, or of the Nephilim before the flood, but he doesn't mention the book of Enoch, which tells you it wasn't regarded among the Jews. Okay? Because he's talking about these scenes and all this stuff. These are like secret texts that these guys have. What if you come into our mystery cult, we'll show this stuff to you. Okay? And we know in the early Christians it happens because by the time this stuff seems to start popping up among the early Christians, what seems to happen is that some of these Essenes become monks, Christian monks, and there's mixing between the Essenes and the Christian monks, and these legends start to creep into the church. Okay? So it's kind of like one of the forms of Gnosticism that's coming in. Well, what you have is Josephus says, because he didn't know which was going to happen first, it being destroyed by water, it being destroyed by fire, that the ancients made 2 columns and they wrote down all this information. Okay? And this information was meant to basically just keep track of ebbs and flows and times and seasons and stuff like that. Okay? This is where the biblical term observer of times comes from. Okay? An observer of times is literally somebody who observes times and seasons. Okay? Ben Franklin would have been one of these. He invented the modern almanac. Okay? And when you can keep track of ebbs and flows and flood seasons and gravitational stuff having to do with the planets and stuff that changes, eclipses and stuff like that, and you have knowledge like that, you can make yourself a pretty powerful priest. And that's why you have an Apocalypto in Mel Gibson's movie. They're sacrificing hearts to make the eclipse go away. Okay? This is where these cults come from. Guys who know what's coming because they have very old records that have observed times, and because they know what's coming, they manipulate things. Okay? This still happens in business. This still happens in the stock market. This still happens with wars and manipulations and Illuminati confirmed crap. Okay? It happened in Ben Franklin's day, and I'm very sure Ben Franklin used his knowledge of demographic information to feed both Thomas Malthus's population control theories and Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, and help launch the French and American revolutions. Okay? Well, that's what happened back in Nimrod's day. According to Zoroaster, now this is, or I'm sorry, not according to Zoroaster, according to Jubilees. And this is a different account, because in Josephus's account, he's saying this is just natural information that the descendants of Adam kept written down over the years. Okay? And over the years, they realized, hey, you know what? Every 14 years we have a pretty low rain season. It's just natural cycles in the earth, because everything's a circle and everything's a clock. Everything just eventually cycles back around. We know because we live to be almost 1,000. Okay? And it seems like every 14 years we have a drought. That's good to know, because years later when people aren't living to be 1,000 years, and you know every 14 years you have a drought, well, most people are only going to live through 2 or 3 of those. Okay? And if some guy knows that every 14 years and can kind of convince you that you can appease the gods, and if you don't give him money, there's going to be a drought. Okay? So that's good information to know, so people don't get deceived by some idiot claiming he has the power of the gods. Okay? And what happens is that Canon does exactly that. Okay? And Canon seems to be, I believe, a brother of Selah. So Selah would be the father of Hebrew, where the Hebrews come from. Their dad is Arphaxad, which is where the Chaldeans come from. And Canaan is where the Magi come from. And the Magi become a tribe of the Medes, because he marries, like, Madai, according to Canaan, or according to Jubilees, marries his sister, and then he marries Madai's daughter. And so that's why they're mingled in with the Medes. Okay? He's basically living amongst his in-laws. Okay? He seems to be the guy who is Zoroaster. And this Vishtamshu, or whatever this guy's name is, this king who supports him, seems to be Nimrod, spreading around his faith. And this dynasty they call the Canem dynasty. Okay, remember, Jubilee says his name is Canon. This dynasty is called the Canem dynasty. And according to Zoroastrianism, this Canem dynasty starts 2,000 years after the dynasty that ends, that starts with the first man who wore animal skins. He had a son that was killed by a god, a demon god or whatever. And then that son has another son that avenges himself on that one, and that's where that dynasty comes from. So that's their corruption of Cain and Abel and Adam and Seth. And then that dynasty ends after 2,000 years, which would have been when Noah dies. Okay, and then this other guy becomes the leader of this new dynasty that lasts from this time. Remember, these are the Medes, okay? It lasts from this time until the Achaemenid dynasty, which is basically counting the history of the Medes from Canaan, who's a Magi, and Nimrod would have been probably ruling over them at that time because they would have been allies with him, okay? And then all the way down to, I want to show you how big the Median Empire gets. This is the Median Empire by the time of Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon. That's how big it is, okay? This is Hagmatana. Alexander the Great is going to call Ecbatana. Okay, that's what the Greeks call it. He's going to take this eventually, but they basically marry in with the Persians, and it becomes the Medo-Persian Empire, and then eventually the Persian Empire. But the Medes built this. Okay, the Persians did not build this empire; they were just lucky enough to marry in with the Medes. The Medes built this. What the Persians did is the Medes take over Babylon and Elam. And then the Persians are going to eventually absorb the empire and grow it too big and lose to Alexander the Great. Okay, but it's the Medes who build this. Okay, and so you're talking about this region right here. Notice this is the Babylonia region, which is going to get sacked 3 or 4 times before Nebuchadnezzar. Okay, it's going to be overrun by, first it's going to be Akkadians and Sumerians are going to split because of the language difference. Then you're going to have Amorites overrun it largely, or in Mitanni and Hurrians. Then you're going to have Hittites overrun a big chunk of it. Then you're going to have Amorites totally take the thing over. Then you're going to have the Amorites fall, and then we're going to get into that in our Judges series, okay? You're going to have the Amorites fall, and then you're going to have basically Assyria starts to take over at that time and eventually takes over what's left, and it's not a powerful kingdom again. And then it becomes a powerful kingdom again in the fall of Assyria because Nebuchadnezzar's grandpa helps with the fall of Assyria. And his allies in helping with the fall of Assyria, see where Nineveh is? Are the Medes. So these guys are going to ally with these guys to overthrow these guys and knock out the Assyrian Empire, and that's when Babylon takes over all this stuff. But they never took a drop from the Medes because the Medes had almost everything the Persian Empire had. Okay? So this empire that has existed from Nimrod's day, growing from Nimrod's day, okay? It's mostly Japhethites. You see the Elamites are Semites. The Cappadocians, I forget they might be descended from Meshech. The Armenians are descended from Gomer. The Medes are descended from Madai. And I believe the rest of these guys are descended from Turkish peoples and Medes and like mixtures of them. Okay? So this is mostly a Japhethite kingdom. This is mostly Semite. Okay? And a little bit of Cushite in here. This is all Semite. Okay? This kingdom just keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger and stronger and stronger and stronger. These guys do eventually, some of them, take over Pakistan from the Hindus and push them south, and that's why the northern Indians are light-skinned and look closer to like Afghanistanis and stuff. Okay? So these guys seem to have very old records, and I mean old records like here's who Kush married to produce the Indian people. Okay? The Persians have this stuff today. Okay? Well, what probably happened when the Jews were among them, they realized you have really old stinking records, and this stuff seems to relatively accord with what we believe about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and Noah, and Adam, and all this stuff. And what they're trying to do is reconcile the two things. And what they're doing in the course of reconciling these things are absorbing myths about gods and kings and giants that are post-flood and treating them like they're pre-flood. And because the Essenes and whatever this tradition is a mystery cult sect. I mean, if you really read what they're saying in the Book of Jubilees, they're saying that Moses got a mystery version and a mystery language that was to kind of accompany the law, but you had to be privileged to understand it. Okay? You had to know, like he's saying, it's a Targum language. In other words, it's an oral thing. It's an oral tradition that that it wasn't even in the common Hebrew tongue. Okay? And that basically they're secret mysteries. It is a mystery called, okay? These are secret mysteries that only the enlightened are able to have, okay? And what it seems to be is these guys start writing the Book of the Giants. That's probably the original. And whatever this is, it's not written like biblical stuff. It's just stories, okay? It's stories about stuff that happened to be with the giants. And people are probably compiling this and trying to line it up with biblical things. And there's probably some oral history in there that has some truth in it. There's definitely some falsehood in there. And what they're going to do is ultimately pile this all together and write the Book of Enoch. And the book, this Book of Enoch tradition is going to go till the 3rd century AD. These 2nd, 3rd, and 4th Enoch, these were written well after the church. This was the only one that was written before the church. And it's bullcrap. Okay? What they are is they're taking stuff from the Book of the Giants and Jewish oral history, and they're going to claim, now this is what they say, where Josephus has, and I don't know where he gets this oral tradition from, but Josephus is accounting. Josephus is actually reading histories of Babylonians, Persians, Syrians, Egyptians, and Jews. Okay? That's where Josephus gets his history from. Okay? And his history is pretty non-mythological. There's not a lot of fanciful stuff in it. There might be stuff that has political leanings and even theological leanings to it, but there's not a lot of weird fairy tales in it. Okay? It seems pretty plain. Okay? So I'm going to trust him over the Book of Jubilees any day of the week. Okay? He says that the stuff that was on these pillars is just stuff that the sons of Adam collected. Well, the Book of Enoch is going to have a different story. The Book of Enoch is going to say that this astrological data and all this stuff was given to Enoch by an angel. And then the angel is going to give it to Enoch, but his descendants are going to corrupt it and use it to create false gods. And he's describing astrology, worship them like gods and corrupt man and all this stuff, okay? So what they're accounting is what happens among the Magi was told to Enoch before. Okay? And the Book of Jubilees is going to go even further, and he's going to say that the stuff that was written on those pillars, that rock or whatever, was founded by the Watchers. And the Watchers taught this stuff to the people before the flood, and eventually is going to turn into stories in the Book of Enoch that basically these Watchers taught people these were the people who actually created the Nephilim, the angels who slept with women, taught them all kinds of stuff like about makeup, about birth control, about how to interbreed species, all these weird things that you hear on all these Nephilim Illuminati videos. It's all coming from the Book of Enoch, okay? And they're claiming that they taught them all this stuff. Do we have any evidence of this in Scripture? No, we don't. We just have angels mating with women and producing sons who are giants, and they were the men of old, men of renown. Okay? The famous men of old. Okay? And that's all we have. And in Moses' day, he knows that there's all kinds of myths and legends going around about these giants that are probably post-flood. And he's saying, yeah, that's been going on for a while. Really general, okay? All your men of renown, your demigods, your half-gods, your Zeuses and your Nimrods and your Gilgameshes and all these weird stuff is just Nephilim. That's all he's saying. He's saying something really general about the Nephilim, okay? And he's saying they were Nephilim before the flood and after the flood, and these giants that were produced by the Nephilim became the mighty men of old, the men of renown, okay? He's not saying that we have all these legends about stuff that was before the flood. He's saying the ones after the flood became famous for this, that, and the other thing. That's where you're going to get your gods from, okay? Or your demigods, your heroes. Your heroes of old, your men of renown, your heroes were considered to be demigods, like half-gods. Like Hercules was, I believe is Samson, but they make him out to be a demigod. Gilgamesh, I believe, was Nimrod, but they make him out to be a demigod. Half man, half god, son of Zeus type stuff, okay? And Moses seems to know this. It seems to be understood among the Egyptians, because guess what? When did they start keeping their records and become a really powerful empire? Right after the Tower of Babel. And according to stuff that's in like the book of Jasher, and I don't know if this is true or not, but to be a pharaoh, you had to know all the 70 languages. Now, probably not, because Joseph has an interpreter, but I'll bet the Egyptians knew all the 70 languages. They had the most powerful empire in the world, and the whole world was coming to them for grain for some time. Okay? They probably knew all the languages of the world, or at least all the languages of the Mediterranean and Near East. Okay? So they know these stories going around, and they know their mixtures because they know they have records from before, and they've got Joseph who's super wise with them, and he hears from God. Okay? But they don't write a lot about it because there isn't a lot about it. All you know is you had Nephilim before the flood, you had Nephilim after the flood. They're right in Genesis. And that they became these men of renown because these myths and legends are now circulating around after the confusion of languages. That's it. That's all there is to it. But the Book of Enoch is going to have this whole advanced thing about how Enoch gets all this eschatological stuff. And this eschatological stuff seems to be mixed from Judaism, possibly from prophets who are not in the canon, because there is some stuff that's unique to that, but that stuff may have also came from Zoroastrianism. Zoroastrianism talks about a conflagration at the end of the world. Okay, we don't really have that in the Old Testament. We have it in 2 Peter, and we have it kind of in the book of Revelation, and they believe that they got it from Zoroastrianism. Because it starts appearing in Judaism after they're in Persia. So does the millennium. We don't really have a clear testimony. We have typology that could point to a millennium, but we don't have a clear testimony of the millennium until you get to things like Barnabas, who says Jesus told him, and John the Apostle in the book of Revelation. Okay? So it looks like there is stuff that is traded or possibly borrowed, possibly oral history, possibly true, possibly false, mixed up. But where the lie comes in is when these guys come and say, Enoch wrote this stuff down and we kept it in a perfectly preserved tradition, but only the secret mystery cult people knew it. That's the lie, okay? We Essenes have the book of Enoch, have the book of Jubilees, and I'm going to go through these things, and there's so much stuff in it that contradicts the book of Genesis. So much stuff. It's absurd, contradicts the law, contradicts the book of Genesis, testimony of the patriarch, and what they all boil down to is the Jews are the pure ones, we're racially pure. It's not quite Sethian Gnosticism where you have the Cainite race and the Sethite race, and one is, it's not quite that, but it's the Jews were pure and God picked them out from the days of Jacob, and he didn't give a crap about the rest of the Gentiles. And he picked them alone, and everyone was supposed to keep the Sabbath, but he only cared that the Jews kept the Sabbath because he loved them and hated everyone else, and they were more righteous than everyone else, and that's why. And everything they do, they spin it to be because they're so righteous. Okay? When you get down to the Jewish revolt, the Essenes are going to join in the Jewish revolt. They actually have one of their number is a commander in the Jewish revolt, and the city of Qumran is going to get killed, get destroyed right before Jerusalem is destroyed. It's like the second to last city that's destroyed because they're destroying all the strongholds of Judea before they go to Jerusalem and sack that because they don't want it having backup. Okay, and one of them is Qumran, and there was a Essene general that Josephus accounts who is part of that. So this is the total opposite of what Ken Johnson, who I just think is a big fat liar now, is saying. He's saying the Essenes all just became Christians, and it's bullcrap. They were a celibate cult. They were probably mixing Stoicism. They definitely seem to be mixing stuff that came from Zoroastrianism and probably Babylonian myths as well. And then they are writing this in this pseudo-epigraphia. And pseudo-epigraphia means false writing. It's false writing. They're claiming the name of somebody like Enoch or the patriarchs or these different, and they have tons of these writings. They have tons of these writings. And he is going to claim that they all became Christians. But I've got Hippolytus right here, and I know the stuff that he's saying, and I mean recent stuff that he's saying, stuff that I'm hearing him say this week. Okay? John the Baptist started baptizing because he learned it from the Essenes. Bullcrap. If anything, the Essenes learned it from him. Okay? John the Baptist is full of his... The Essenes, you have all this stuff in Hippolytus about the Essenes, okay? And the Essenes wear linen, white linen, and sandals or whatever. John wears goat's hair and a leather belt. And they wear like linen with like, it's They dress totally different. They eat vegetarian. John eats bugs. They're celibate. Paul calls forbidding marriage doctrine demons. They say they don't forbid it, but just everybody's voluntarily celibate to be in the cult. And I'm like, no, it's a cult. They all live together. They adopt young boys. There are some women among them because women want to join it, but they never entrust anything to women, is what they're saying. And they're still around in Hippolytus's day. This is like early 3rd century. He says they don't have a city anymore, but they all live in apartments together. And they basically live communally and have a bunch of weird rituals and stuff like that. Okay? So the Essenes did not become Christians. Probably some of them became monks and probably started mixing in the monks with all these writings and Gnostic stuff. And that's what monasteries are. They're mystery cults. Okay? Monks, yes, you had some monks that were keeping the scriptures, but they were keeping all kinds of writings, and they were mixing them, and they were reading them, and they're getting drunk and buggering each other because all they do is make wine and not hang out with women. Okay? That's what happens in a monastery. And what you have is the guys who are basically like a new kind of mystery priesthood, and some of them really take it seriously, and they're like, I'm a eunuch till I die because I'm just part of the mystery cult. And other ones are just like, I had a little too much wine the other night, and this lad was looking kind of feminine, and I made a mistake, but I will definitely whip myself for a month straight. And then it goes on and on and on until they're just openly buggering each other by the 1300s, and they're writing it down. Like the Lollards are writing it down. Like, we know these people bugger each other. This is gross. Let's get this stuff out of here. Okay? So what you end up with is these 3 competing sects. Remember, you're going to have the Sadducees, and I don't know for certain that the writings of the Apocrypha are all like accepted by the Sadducees. I don't really know. What the Sadducees seem to be doing is allegorizing stuff, and once you start allegorizing stuff, then you can have pseudoepigraphia and non-factual history and stuff like that come into your canon, because it's not about whether or not it's true, it's about the moral lesson that it teaches. You reduce the Bible to Aesop's fables. So my guess would be that the Sadducees thought this stuff was legit, and the Sadducee-leaning, in other words, more Hellenistic-leaning Christians who allegorize stuff would have thought this is more legit. Okay? Because again, it doesn't matter if Nebuchadnezzar ruled over Assyria or Babylon. What the point is the moral lesson that it teaches. It's like an Aesop's fable, right? And we both know hares and tortoises don't talk, and yet we get a moral lesson out of an Aesop's fable. And we know that donkeys don't talk, and yet we get a moral lesson out of the story of Balaam. And we know that probably most of the stuff in the Bible never happened, and yet we get moral lessons out of it. And that crept forward into Origen, into Augustine, and into the liberal theologians of the Enlightenment era onward. Okay? So probably they accepted the Apocrypha. The Pharisees had the Mishnah and the Talmud. That's their extra biblical. This is why we're the only ones who really know the secret truth. And the Essenes had their just totally fake, fabricated, fictional writings that they claimed were written by Enoch, Moses, and the 12 patriarchs. And they also had the Book of the Giants. That's it. That's how you understand what happened. Now, as this series goes on, and as I study these books, because the reason I'm studying them, not because I believe I'm going to gain anything spiritual for them, but because I believe I'm going to be able to unravel the lie of how we got from the Tower of Babel to all this mixing of Jewish philosophy, because it's not just the Jews who are doing this. Pythagoras does this. Pythagoras goes and studies among the Egyptian mysteries. It says he spent like 20 years there learning from every cult and club and priestly organization he could find, which probably included the Jews, and the Jews believed that, okay, because there would have been Jews in Alexandria at that time, okay? No, I'm sorry, Alexandria didn't exist yet. There would have been Jews in Egypt for sure from Babylonian captivity, but this is during the time of the Persians that he's doing this, okay? He then gets taken captive by, I think it's Cambyses, who is after, I want to say he's after Darius or Artaxerxes, one of the two. So it's pretty early on in that period when Daniel would still be alive. He gets taken captive, I think, to Mesopotamia, and he lives and learns among the Magi for like 15 years, okay? Daniel would have been in Susa at this time, and he would have been a pretty old man, and he probably had nothing to do with Pythagoras. But he would have learned stuff from people who very likely had Jewish stuff mixed in. And he's going to come back, and he's going to come up with the triad, okay? A god that's a monad that has two, a duad or a dyad or whatever. Yes, all this stuff's in Star Wars, okay? The dyad and the force is literally, comes from Pythagoreanism. So Pythagoras is going to mix all this stuff, and he's going to come up. He's going to be the first one to call himself a philosopher, lover of wisdom, because he's pretty much studied the known knowledge of the world, and he's reduced it down to a mathematical science and a cult. And for some reason, he hates fava beans because they look kind of like nads, and they make you fart. And he has all kinds of weird rules and stuff like this, but he loves triangles, he loves 3s and 1s and stuff like that, and he comes up with the ideas that eventually become the Trinity, okay? We don't call the God the Trinity, okay? I don't have a theoretical problem with calling God triune. I have a problem with naming him Trinity when his name is Father, and the name that we are given by which to be saved is Jesus. So there we go. I call my dad Dad. If I'm pissed, I'll call him some other name. Okay? And so I don't address God by some name, by some theorist that came from cults. I don't. Okay? So here's the thing. We're going to go through these books because what this is about is me trying to figure out what order they came in. This is the order I think they came in. I think the book of Genesis, then the book of Enoch, then the book of Jubilees, then the testimony of the patriarchs. Okay? We're going to go through all these and show you why they're crap. We'll probably go through the books of Maccabees and all of the Apocrypha and show you why they're crap. And then we'll go through the Talmud and show you why they're crap. Okay? Now, when Jesus says 3 shepherds I abhorred and I basically got rid of them all in 1 month, I don't think he's counting the Essenes. I think he's counting the Pharisees, Sadducees, and Herod, or the Herodians, because he specifically mentions those. The Essenes, the reason Jesus isn't talking about the Essenes is they're a relatively small, culty group, and apparently their mystery science theater stuff is not well known. The book of Enoch is well known. We know the book of Enoch is floating around. Okay? But the book of Jubilees doesn't seem to be well known. Contradicts the scriptures. It seems like somebody would have said something about it before Origen. And by the time you get to Origen, he's mixing with the Gnostics and the monks, and you've had these cults like the Encratites and the, I forget their name, Alcatites and stuff like that there in Mesopotamia. Tatian the Syrian seems to mix with these people because he's in and out of all kinds of cults, and he's from the Mesopotamian region. And then Origen seems to be getting stuff from him. Clement comes from a background in the Egyptian mysteries. That's when these writings seem to emerge in the church. So when people were like, oh, the early church thought they were blah, 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 I don't care what the early church thought. Okay? Now, I go through all this stuff, and I find a reference to Jubilees as if it is something. The first reference I have, okay, I have this library of all the early church stuff, and I'm sure there's more, but what I have, am I rightly dividing, if I put in Jubilees, these are all the books that mention the word Jubilees at all, okay? You see the testimony of the 12 patriarchs, I looked at it, these are all footnotes, okay? The only one I found, see, this is the Gutenberg project of ebook of Servetus and Calvin. That's a story. I don't know what that is. Confessions of St. Augustine. Let's see. The only thing I found that quotes the Book of Jubilees is Epiphanes of Salamis. Epiphanes of Salamis would have been early 5th century. No, I'm sorry. Yeah, early 5th century, contemporary with Jerome and Augustine. Okay? Might even be 6th century, but I'm pretty sure it's 5th century. He's going to write this Panarion, and he's going to write a bunch of stuff against a bunch of sects. And he mentions the Book of Jubilees in one time, and what he is mentioning is he's refuting the Sethian Gnostics, who are claiming that Seth and Enoch and all this, or Seth and Cain were two different lines, and one came from like this mother goddess, and the other one came from the angels. And so this is going to be the theory where the serpent seed doctrine kind of comes from. Okay. And he is going to mention how the Book of Jubilees records all the wives of these people, because it's based on a theory of, okay, if there's just Cain and Abel, where did all the women come from and all this stuff, okay? He's going to mention the Book of Jubilees, mentioning all their wives and proving that they're related, okay? So he cites the Book of Jubilees as if it is true history, or as if it has some credibility to it as a historical source, but not as scripture, okay? He just cites it as saying the Book of Jubilees has been around a lot longer than these Sethian Gnostics. Says these guys had wives, and here's who they were. This is going to be in section 3 of book 1. So it says 1 through 46. So it looks like section 3, chapter 6, book 1. He mentions the little Genesis, and it just says, it contains the name of Cain's and Seth's wives, that they were their sisters and stuff. So all he's trying to do is saying the Book of Jubilees proves that people much older than the Sethian Gnostics believe that Cain and Abel were definitely related. They were both from Adam. And he uses the Bible, and he also uses the Book of Jubilees to prove it. Okay? So he's not saying it's canon, but he does treat it like it's true. Okay? But you're talking 5 centuries later. Remember this stuff. This guy, he knows a lot of stuff. He speaks like 6 languages. He's able to read stuff. I think he lives on Cyprus, and he travels around like Egypt and Jerusalem, Palestine, stuff like that. And so he seems to read a lot of ancient literature, and some of his stuff he's going to get from Irenaeus and Hippolytus, but he writes on tons of, this is one book of like 4 books, and it's like the Simonians, Meanders, Saturnians, Basilides, Nicolaitans, Gnostics. He writes on everybody, and I don't know if he writes on the Essenes. I haven't read through this whole thing yet. I've read good chunks of it for my Rightly Dividing book. So he's going to access a lot of stuff. It doesn't mean his judgment is perfect or he speaks for all the church. The point is, if people thought the Book of Jubilees was canon, you're not going to have 5 centuries of the church go by before someone references it. And in these books, you have people footnoting where they think the Book of Jubilees was referenced. And this is my entire library that I used for my Rightly Dividing book. And this is everything that even uses the word Jubilees, okay? 12 Patriarchs is obviously based on the Book of Jubilees. This is a modern book, so I don't care. Something in the Confessions of Augustine, apparently. And then the Book of Jubilees itself. So the point is, when you have guys like Ken Johnson and Sean, what's-his-face, saying that the Book of Jubilees was canon, and he literally is saying Jesus thought it was canon, the apostles thought it was canon, the early church thought it was canon, okay? This guy is a liar supreme. I've listened to him on debates and stuff. He is a liar, and he's a sophist. And you watch when he just starts, I don't know a better word for it, but mind screwing somebody in a debate, and he gets a smirk on his face like he loves what he's doing, because he equivocates and plays all these games to not answer the question, and he keeps going back and appealing to these things like their authority. And this is what's stupid. Nobody should be having this guy on to debate. I mean, Standing for Truth is just sinning by having this guy on platforming himself, because he is now up to 127,000 subs. How many did he have before he started being on Standing for Truth? I don't know, but this guy's only been doing this stuff for 6 years, okay? For 6 years, he's been, he started as a Bible teacher. Who knows what he was teaching? Then he started teaching on Apollyon. I don't know if he was like a Messianic or Hebrew roots guy all along, but he starts getting into all this conspiracy stuff, and now he's putting himself out there as, you see 5 years ago, he starts putting himself out there as somebody who is, he's a Torah observant guy, and then he eventually gets into flat earth stuff. He's into Rob Skiba, who's just a nut. He's dead now. He died during COVID, but like, he was a nut. He was trying to say how, like, our army has Nimrod's body and they're trying to resurrect Nimrod's body, and he's a Nephilim and all this weird stuff. He's an insane dude, and he became one of the leading proponents for flat earth, and this guy apparently followed him. And so you see all this conspiracy stuff. There's Tesla, you know, like, and then he eventually gets into basically saying that the Book of Enoch and the Book of Judges and all this stuff are canon scripture, okay? And then he starts debating, and you see here's him 4 years ago. You see a video about like mine are, okay, 2,800 views on a good day, right? Maybe every now and then he gets a video, and again, these are stuff that people maybe clicked on after the fact, but when you see his older videos and you see most of these things just have a few thousand views. Now we go to, since he's been on Standing for Truth over and over and over again, well, he's got videos with 386,000 views, 77,000 views, 54,000 views, okay? He's not growing because he's organically growing because he's a good Bible teacher, because anyone who listens to him and just fact checks his stuff knows he's a liar and he's just a sniveling turd, okay? But when you have channels like Standing for Truth and other dumb idiots who keep having this guy in debate, he's against the Trinity. He is totally old covenant, where, you know, it's a renewed covenant, not a new covenant. He believes Jesus is keeping physical sacrifices and slaying animals in the temple daily now. It's just he's a nut, and he's a legitimate cult leader, and he's growing. But you see how it's like, I mean, these are his popular videos from 3 years ago have 10,000 views, but all of a sudden he starts being on Standing for Truth, and he's going from 10,000 views to 12,000, 14,000, 15,000, 16,000. I mean, most of the stuff's in the past 2 years. 386,000 views. Like, and I mean, he's a Gnostic cult leader. I don't care what you say. People Christianize stuff a lot, but these people are liars, and these liars are going to multiply as the days continue. And what they're trying to teach you, and I hope I'm not getting this message to anybody, is that what you need to understand the Old Testament, how to please a God, what's coming, is not in the Bible. That you need to go to these secret mystery documents to figure out the real truth. These people are not going to lead you away from the Antichrist. They're going to lead you into being completely dumbfounded when the Antichrist gets here because you thought you were supposed to be gone. Or they're going to lead you into keeping the sacrifices on the Temple Mount when it starts, because they think that's what's supposed to be going down. These people, and remember, Jesus said that false teachers and false prophets are going to multiply in the last day, and they are. Okay? So what I'm trying to do with this stuff is demystify it, debunk it, and get it back down to here's where the lie evolved. You have everything you need in the Bible. Okay? You have everything you need in the Bible. And yeah, some of the stuff is helped by understanding more about history and the original languages and stuff like that. But for the most part, if you needed to know more about the Nephilim, it would have been written down. If you needed to know more about the origins of paganism, it would have been written down. God tells you don't get involved in this stuff right in the Word. Okay? You don't necessarily need to know the origin story to just obey God and not do. You don't need to know why you shouldn't eat the tree of the knowledge of good and evil to not eat it. You just need to know that God said to not eat it, okay? And he's not in the business of like explaining where all the bull crap comes from, because there's too many versions of it, okay? I'm doing that because I want people to be equipped to call bull crap on this stuff and point these guys to the facts that shows you that we know they taught bull crap. And back in the early church, you had guys like Irenaeus and Hippolytus and Epiphanes do stuff like that, okay? These were the faithful. I'm not saying these guys were right in everything, and I'm not saying I'm right in everything, but the faithful people would debunk this crap, and they'd go, you know your word, that's the canon, and then you shoot this crap down. You judge it with that hammer, okay? And you don't let some guy show up 2,000 years later after we've known the church has pretty much accepted from the time of Jerome that the Apocrypha aren't canon. The church has never accepted any of the Essene writings as canon. Okay? In fact, we didn't know about most of them. We learned about a lot of these things from the Qumran scrolls, and then we find out, well, the Ethiopians have it. We don't care what the Ethiopians had. The Ethiopians sat right between Alexandria, which was full of Gnosticism, and the Nag Hammadi library, which was full of Gnosticism, and then they traded with the Persians, who had Zoroastrianism, and the Sassanid Empire was right across. They controlled Yemen, right across the Gulf from them, and that's where Manichaeanism came from. And then they have Jews there, and they claim to have stolen the Ark of the Covenant, and they claim to have a line descended from Solomon. And I'm calling bullcrap on probably much of that. I know they don't have the Ark of the Covenant, and they never did. Okay? The idea that these guys stole the Ark of the Covenant in the days of Solomon because Solomon had a secret kid that he didn't write down anywhere is just dumb. Okay? And you have cults and you have false religions trying to make themselves the OG in the center of things because people make their living on that crap. So we don't go to the Ethiopians who have stuff in their canon that we know came from the Middle Ages to validate our canon. Okay? We know they have this stuff. We, as scholars, we want to know where it originated from. We want to understand that for our understanding of history, but we don't need that to understand Scripture. Okay? The idea of lost books of the Bible, lost books of the canon, Jewish conspiracies that kept stuff out of the canon that we need. Okay? Whenever you hear this stuff, it is 100% bullcrap. Don't believe it. We have what we need. And again, by the time we're done with this, I'm going to have a complete series on the canon. And then hopefully by the time I'm done with my apostles' teaching, we'll go through the books of the New Testament in my own translation and just say, here's where they are in order, here's where they came from, and here's why they're valid, here's why it's complete, here's why we have everything we need. Okay? Because that is what you see these guys trying to be here with their Apocrypha and with their Talmud and with their fake books, okay, is what the apostles really were, okay? Those were the ones who Jesus authorized to bind and loose and to properly interpret and draw the new covenant out of the old to see that this was always God's plan. It's not some mystery that they're allegorizing to read it. It's something that it was always there, and God was always saying he's going to do it, and he was showing it in allegory, but also prophesying and also flat out saying it, okay? And they're pulling all those things together to pull in and tell you the new covenant, and here's why we don't have to keep the law anymore. Here's what our rules and our ordinances are. Here's what our marching orders are. We're going to spread the gospel until Jesus comes, and in the end, you're going to have a bunch of false teachers, but don't worry about it, okay? Now, all that being said, I just want to show you guys something. I made a piece of swag. The revival will not be televised. So I'm wearing it. I wore it to the gym. I washed it. This is a large. It's still, it's like a little bit polyester. So, but it's cotton. Breathes good. Good at the gym, and it holds up well after washing. I've got a couple pieces of swag. I made this. I can't sell this because I couldn't go around selling something with a Batman logo on it. So I just made that for myself, just for fun. And then I made a t-shirt and a sweatshirt with the Revival Will Not Be Televised logo on it. And those of you guys that are following the channel, like, if you understand what I mean by the Revival Will Not Be Televised and underground publishing, I'm preparing people. My goal is to prepare people to know their stuff, get their writings. You can download all this stuff on your personal computer and have it, like this library that I have. Get your writings, get your records, get your stuff that you need to debunk stuff, and to write stuff and explain stuff to people in case Christians ever get kicked off the internet. And what my goal is not really to start a movement around me or some new denomination or some, myself as a teacher, but to get people more versed and more comfortable and more confident pulling together these original writings and calling bullcrap on all the false stuff, and then staying in the Word and knowing the Word very well. So I believe there's a time when we're going to go underground, and so I started underground publishing to that effect. And the revival not be televised is there because we know that the wise will lead many to righteousness, but it's not necessarily going to be a big mainstream revival, and that's why that's why I wrote the revival will not be televised. So that's one of the things that I'm close to being set up with a Patreon and this, and I wanted to wear this and set it up and make sure it's a good quality product before I say that. But like with the books and hopefully Patreon donations and the swag, we can kind of get the word out a little bit, and it'd be a blessing to me, and it would help me kind of maintain my finances while I'm doing this work, because this is a full-time job for me. So hope you guys are blessed by this. Again, I'm gonna probably be going hand in hand talking about the canon, these false writings, and the history of the ancient occult stuff over this next year, while I'm teaching through the Bible as well. So hopefully, as we're doing this over the next year, we'll get to the point where we're on the New Testament, and by then my apostles' teaching should be done. And after that, I will probably start writing my Way of the Serpent book, which will probably take, I'm hoping to have that done in like a year and a half. And then by that time, I'll have done enough research to write my House of God book. And I'm hopefully going to have both those next 3 books all published over the next 2-ish, maybe 3 years. And by that time, I'm hopefully going to start working on my Millennium Underground series. So that's it. That's Maccabean stuff. Again, this is all, this slide deck that I'm building here is basically the basis for building my Way of the Serpent book. And I'm eventually going to write this, but the next chunk of this I'm going to go through with you guys when I get a chance is Zoroastrianism, but I'm going to try to commit to keep doing a book of the Bible once a week. So for those of you who actually are with me to study the Bible, you're the home team. The rest are just, they're not in the Illuminati. They're just listeners. They're not inducted. They're not initiates into the right and faithful ways of the secret, whatever. Anyways, hope you guys are blessed by this, and hope you have a great rest of your week. Batman out. Peace.
Peace, I'm out. I'm Batman.